in the next about hour or so, we will highlight different ways that you can be a housing advocate and also provide some examples of what's possible. Now we're going to go over kind of ways that we'll engage this afternoon. So during our time together, we hope that we can all engage in a respectful way as a community. So let's do some practice. The first one is use I statements. So you really want to speak from your own experience. Second is try it on. So we all have our own biases, but make sure that you're willing to kind of try on new ideas and, be willing to be surprised and learn something new this afternoon. Third, observe confidentiality. So we hope that we want to kind of create a space for folks where, everyone feels safe and comfortable sharing with your neighbors, your ideas. And then fourth, make space and take space. So make sure that you're taking note of who's speaking and also who's not speaking. So if you tend to want to talk a lot, try to make space for others and vice versa. And then lastly, number five, you can also pass on responding if you don't wish to speak. That is also okay as well. So now, who is LA Moss? So just a little bit about LA Moss. We're a community organization based in Elysian Valley, AKA Frogtown. So our focus is on promoting housing affordability and economic resilience for working class communities of color in Northeast LA. So to do this effectively, we believe that this work needs to really be driven by our community, so that the work really prioritizes building community ownership, leadership, and then also partnership with neighbors like you guys. So today is the final part of our Housing Here workshop series. So kind of in support of residents in defining housing policy, shaping housing solutions, and becoming housing advocates. While these workshops are kind of open to everyone, we hope that the series has really served as a resource to our working class neighbors and those most vulnerable to displacement. Lastly, we really want to highlight our funding partners at SCAG, LISC, LA, Wells Fargo Foundation, California Community Foundation, HMC Foundation, and Parsons Foundation for supporting this work. So we're just going to do a little overview, recap of workshop number one. So in our first workshop, which was titled Community-Led Housing Strategies, we shared how the general housing process works. And then we also highlighted the various kind of plans, policies, and players that build the housing that we live in. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then we also spoke about our housing values and how they can kind of translate over. And in our second workshop, we spoke about what housing collectively kind of envisioned what a more equitable housing system could look like for communities. So some of the values that our group shared, they included home is family and community. So many of us shared that home is wherever our family or community is or is from. So whether that's like a physical house or a neighborhood or a country. Next, we also, one of our values was housing should offer safety and security. So our home should be a place of respite, a grounding place where we can build full lives and plan for the future. And then our another value was that everyone deserves a home. So we kind of believe that we should all have housing and be able to thrive and grow in our communities. And this means housing should be accessible and also affordable. Next is respect the local community. So we also talked about the tension between funding affordable housing in other neighborhoods, but that causing displacement, and there are those also gentrification pressures. And then lastly, build for the collective. So we expressed interest in collective sharing of resources and homeownership of housing. So we are really kind of interested in imagining what personal and collective housing stability can look like, so that we can all have what we need for the future. And then another recap of workshop two. This is more about the solutions, and these are the 5 solutions that we came up with: government investment, requiring affordability, financing solutions, decommodifying housing, and preventing flipping. Thank you. So, ways to be a housing advocate. So, how many can we kind of begin to turn these values and ideas into reality? So, today we'll highlight some of the ways that you can become a housing advocate and help shape the future of housing in Northeast LA. So, I'm going to be passing it on to Linda, and she's going to walk us through some examples.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. Yeah, so to frame, I guess today how we're gonna like talk about the different options or avenues for housing advocacy. We'll highlight 3 main focus areas and then share some tangible strategies. And I want to acknowledge that I know that well, throughout our presentation, we'll be naming some organizations who we partnered with or are familiar with their work. But we know that many of you are also already involved in this work related to housing advocacy. So feel free to share other resources and your own experiences throughout. And we'll have some opportunities where we'll specifically ask you all as well. Next slide. So, one of the first steps to becoming an advocate for any issue is understanding your rights and the resources available to you in your community. With our Housing Here workshop series, we're hoping to make information about the housing process and policies common knowledge for our community members so that residents can be advocates for themselves and their neighbors. Um, and on the screen, this is like a recap of something we shared in our last workshop, where we talked about the history of housing development and different neighborhood changes in Northeast LA. So we know that even before, like long before the pandemic, our community was already experiencing housing insecurity and displacement pressures, issues that have only been heightened over the past year and a half. For LMS during the pandemic, we saw a lot of our neighbors dealing with reduced or lost employment, increased emergency costs, um, mounting rent or mortgage debt, and a lot of uncertainty around evictions. And so I think, especially with our housing system often giving landlords and property owners the advantage, many working class tenants have been most vulnerable during this time. And at LAMS, we work with working class residents of color who are both homeowners and renters, many who have been in the neighborhood for generations. And one of the main ways that we have been advocating for our neighbors is through education and sharing resources. Um, so, for example, when COVID first started spreading locally in LA, we launched the Northeast LA Community Response, which was an initiative that we co-created with the Elysian Valley Senior Group and the Elysian Valley Neighborhood Watch. Um, and with over 150 volunteers, we called and checked in on neighbors weekly. We connected folks to tangible goods such as food or masks or other like PPE. And we also helped demystify housing rights information. So sharing information about the local and statewide eviction protections and mortgage forbearance programs. Um, and another example more recently is we hosted emergency rental assistance program clinics. So we supported tenants in applying for the city's program that was intended to cover unpaid rent for low income tenants who were financially impacted by COVID. Um, and we hosted workshops for the applicants as well as trainings for volunteers who were interested in supporting their neighbors with the application process. And we've since provided one-on-one follow-up support and worked with those tenants to identify additional resources. And while these examples both like live in our organization. There were specific ways for individuals in our neighborhood to advocate for themselves and for others. So um, as I mentioned, like for both, we trained residents on the various housing resources so that they could know it for themselves, but also be able to share it widely. Um, and I think us as an organization, we know that we have access to certain resources and knowledge, and we don't want to hoard that information. We want to make it as accessible as possible so that more of our neighbors have the tools to assert their own agency and power, become self advocates, and to secure these resources for their own communities. And outside of LMS, there are lots of organizations that specialize in housing rights and tenant support. Um, Orgs that provide free legal support to prevent evictions or that help explain a lot of the local housing protections and policies. So a few that we just wanted to highlight are Housing Rights Center and Eviction Defense Network. They're two organizations that provide outreach, education, and counseling related to housing. Eviction Defense Network specifically provides legal representation for tenants facing evictions. And then HRC provides fair housing education for both tenants and landlords. Another grassroots group is the LA Tenants Union. They organize buildings and neighborhoods to protect tenants from illegal evictions, landlord harassment, and unsafe living conditions. And they really are committed to building tenant power through education, advocacy, and direct action. And in Northeast LA, there is their like local chapters are called locals. So the LA Tenants Union Northeast Local is the one that organizes tenants in our region. So another way to be a housing advocate is to shape local development, which I think we've talked a lot about in the past couple of workshops, but this is really where you can influence what gets built and who gets to live there. And I think whether it's new construction or older buildings or homes being cleared out, development can be the most visible sign of neighborhood change. And at LMS, we do believe that development without displacement is possible, but only if it's driven by and reflective of the community. Um, but I think we know that many developments are not built with the immediate community in mind. An example being the tendency for a lot of the newer developers to be building for the highest return on investment. So that results in a lot of studio and one bedroom units in neighborhoods that are home to large family households. Um, and in our first workshop, we talked about housing players who are shaping local development every day. So those can include for-profit or nonprofit developers, flippers, which folks mentioned is a major concern, both small and corporate landlords. But we also talked about the ways that we as everyday community members can also be the players by building or preserving affordable housing, or at least demanding accountability from the powers that be and shifting the rules of the game. So, um, great. So at LA Moss, we wanted to just share a couple of examples through which we've tried to shape or shift local development. Um, so at LMS, just again, we think housing development can build on the context of the neighborhood's built environment, really honor local knowledge and culture, and really be inclusive of the lived experiences of those who are most marginalized or vulnerable to displacement, who are often working class renters. And the way we approach this is always starting with community engagement and collaboration so that residents can really direct what this looks like. Um, so one example is our Backyard Homes project. This is one of the first housing initiatives we launched, and it's a pilot project where homeowners across LA become developers of affordable housing by building ADUs or accessory dwelling units on their single family lots. Um, and this program stemmed from focus groups and conversations with community members who helped define how this program could be developed. And over the past couple of years, we've been working with residents to design, build, and rent these units that will serve as affordable housing for Section 8 tenants. And yeah, today we have 5 backyard homes being built across the city by homeowners who believe that everyone deserves safe, stable housing. And the program has since inspired other government agencies in LA and other cities to invest in affordable housing solutions on single family properties. Next slide. And then I think that the Backyard Homes project really showed us what was possible when housing is driven by residents. But we also believe that a neighborhood scale initiative, rather than having individual projects across the city, has the potential for deeper impact. So we believe that a similar housing effort that's more directed by residents in Northeast LA can help potentially create more housing stability with more affordable units, like concentrated in neighborhoods that are facing displacement, or having some sort of matching system, so folks at risk of displacement can find ways to stay in their communities. Um, it can also provide more like localized resources, whether that's more tenant support, or just being able to access more resources within a particular area. So, and I think this workshop series and other conversations that we're having with residents in Northeast LA are just a starting point of imagining what a neighborhood housing program can look like. So this, yeah, isn't fleshed out yet, but we do plan on continuing to partner with residents to design an initiative that represents our shared housing values, and incorporates some of the solutions that we came up together in the last workshop. And outside of LMS, there's a lot of ways to stay on top of and shape development in your neighborhood. So one of the ways is by monitoring development projects that are happening and being approved by the city. So most of the housing construction you see is by right, which means there's no public hearing process. Property owners just have to follow the building and safety rules, and it gets approved. But bigger projects usually need permission by like the city planning department, for example. So one way that you can know if a new project is underway is to sign up for a biweekly case report from the city. And there you can access all the applications in LA, and you can search by your like neighborhood council area. So that's one way to just like know what's happening, what's being built and by who, and like what kind of purpose it's serving. And after that, like once you do know what's going on and what's being built, like there are other ways to engage. So um, I think a common example is just by providing public comment on any new developments that are being built in your neighborhood. And this is often through like you can do it via written or verbal form during the entitlement process. And the entitlement process is the time when property owners have to seek permission through a public process to build what they want because their existing rules, the existing rules like don't work for their plans. So it can't just be like by right approved. And every project has a different process based on what they're trying to do, what they're trying to build, and what the purpose is. Um, and there are a few different ways you can share your opinion on that. So whether that's testifying at your local neighborhood council meeting, sharing your thoughts with your local council member, or reaching out to the zoning administrator in the planning department. Um, Great, and I see Lauren also added another option as well. And another way that you can kind of influence these projects is to form your own group or join an already organized group. Um, so one example, for example, is Save Avenue 34. It's a group of residents in Lincoln Heights who have come together trying to block a massive luxury apartment development. And they are flagging some major like health, safety, and affordability concerns for the surrounding community. And yeah, I think Elizabeth just shared in the chat, but you can check out their website for what their demands are and seeing how they have organized as a group of residents. Great. So the last bucket that we wanted to highlight, and definitely not the least, is advocating for equitable policy. And we do believe that one of the main ways to be a housing advocate is to affect policy change. Many of the housing inequities that exist in our communities are the result of the system itself, as much as we can discuss like the different players in who are part of that system. So whether it's a history of redlining or segregation, freeway development that has like cut through communities, or just overall lack of protections for tenants, policy directly impacts how we access and experience housing every day. And policy can occur on many levels of government and cover a lot of different issues. For example, in our first workshop, we talked about how the housing element will be updated this fall by the city of LA, and how it sets the goals for housing for the city for the next decade. And there are also more neighborhood specific policies, also known as community plans, that create rules for individual properties in neighborhoods. Due to the pandemic, there were newer policies on evictions that have changed, with new rules being adopted at the state level. And there's also emerging energy locally and statewide on the grassroots level to advocate for rules that allow tenants the first right to purchase their homes. Um, so those are some examples. And then just highlighting again, like housing policies at different levels are being considered all the time, and there's a lot of different ways you can get involved. So similar to shaping individual development projects, you can always provide public comment, or and verbal testimonies with your opinion to decision makers. Sometimes that's at like a city planning meeting, or other politically appointed body like a commission or an elected official. Again, you can join or form a group. Finding a housing advocacy group that shares your values is another strategy, and we'll highlight a few others. And we invite you to all keep sharing organizations that you're familiar with in the chat. Another way that you can shape policy is through the neighborhood council. So neighborhood council representatives are elected through a voting process and have extra time to speak during the public comment period. Separately, by attending a general board meeting or a committee meeting of the neighborhood council, so such as like their land use or housing meeting, you also have an opportunity to shape their position. One example is our local neighborhood council, which is the Elysian Valley Riverside Neighborhood Council, and they have an environmental and land use committee. And actually next Wednesday, they'll be having a discussion on the housing element. Specifically on the housing element, and there are a lot of similar conversations happening throughout Northeast LA, such as with the Highland Park Neighborhood Council as well. And our team at LA Moss is part of a couple of city and countywide coalitions advocating for equitable policies related to the built environment, which are also opportunities for all of you to participate in as well if you're not already connected to these groups. So Alliance for Community Transit, or ACT LA, is a coalition focused on equitable development near transit for communities of color. One of their more active campaigns is with LA Metro, fighting for better bus service and free fares. And in relation to housing, ACT LA fights for policies that both build and preserve housing near transit that is affordable. Another newer formed coalition, but that's been made up of a lot of the grassroots groups that have been doing this work for a long time, is Keep LA Housed. And this coalition evolved out of like a couple of other coalitions, but in response to the inequities that have been worsened by COVID. And so their three demands are addressing gaps in rental assistance programs, eliminating COVID-related debt, and ending evictions and collateral consequences of rent debt. And these are just a couple of examples in which like you could plug in through LA Moss or through your own organization or as an individual as well. I guess lastly, we just wanted to talk about what LA Moss is going to be doing and different ways you can plug into our work. So one is we want to keep these conversations going with Northeast LA residents and folks that we're already like in regular conversation with, but actually have a space to talk about housing, provide updates on different policies like the housing element, and really begin to do that like co-visioning of like what people want to see and actually turning these ideas and solutions that we have into tangible projects. And so we are going to be starting to have these monthly meetings with folks from Northeast LA. And our first one will be on August 19th from 5 to 7. And we'll share follow-up details about that. But it'll be at our office in Elysian Valley. And we welcome anyone from Northeast LA who believes in centering the voices and values of working class communities of color. And yeah, that's, and we'll share more details about that in the next few weeks. And I think we really want that space to just be led by residents and have them shape the agenda and what they want to bring to the table. And we already have kind of a core group of resident leaders who are meeting regularly, but related to like our food distribution work. So anyway, it'll be a similarly like resident led effort. And I think some examples of what that space could look like could touch on like the three buckets that we've talked about today. So if folks want to learn more specifically about certain rights and resources, we could invite different experts and local organizers to share information that community members are interested in terms of shaping development. We could share a bit more about like our experience with our program, and just create more space for residents to collectively design and envision what they want that program to look like. And then related to policy, again, we're part of a few housing coalitions, and we'll probably connect folks to those spaces in our monthly meetings. With those coalitions, there's always opportunities to share your stories, learn more about organizing and policy, and become more of a leader in those spaces. And another thing that we are going to focus on this summer is just providing more education around the housing element. So with the housing element pending, we'll focus on unpacking the thousands of pages in the draft and providing an overview of how folks can understand the major concepts and see how it relates to some of the housing values that you all have expressed, and how you can also provide public comment at the city planning meeting where it'll be approved later this fall. And as an organization, LMOS is not taking a formal position, but we rather want to make it easier for residents to understand the housing element, share their opinions, and specifically translate their values into the city's housing policy. We will be having a separate workshop to like digest the housing element on August 31st. It'll be online from 12 to 1, but again, we'll send that follow-up in our next email. And I'll pass it now to Andrea to wrap us up.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, so as we're wrapping up, we, covered many ways to be a housing advocate. And so we just want to really thank you all for joining us for this series. It's been a real pleasure. And recording and the presentation, we will share that and it will also be posted. And then we also, look forward to continuing work with you all to kind of build a more equitable housing system in Northeast LA. We have some upcoming kind of opportunities on our kind of like what's next. First is join our workshop series in person. So if any of you happen to miss our first two workshops, we're also starting the series in person and it'll be this Thursday. So please help us kind of spread the word. We'll kind of add that in the chat box on where you can sign up for the workshop. Another thing is kind of learn more about the housing element. So now that the city like housing element draft is out, we want to really help demystify what that policy looks like on, it's going to be on August 31st, and it is from 12 to 1 p.m. Online, so virtually. And then last but not least, you can join our neighborhood organizing meetings. So if you are a Northeast LA resident, we invite you to join in our first monthly meeting, and that's going to be on August 19th. So that's exciting. So just another thank you, and hopefully we'll see you at the in-person workshops.